All right, well, welcome everyone to the panel. We're glad to see you here. I think people are still trickling in, but we're happy that you're joining us today, and we're excited for this panel. I'm going to go ahead and get started because I want to make sure that we use every minute of the time that we have. My name is Kristen Miller, and I'm a professor of space studies here at the American Public University System. I'm also the co-editor-in-chief of the CISA Journal, which is associated with the conference. And I'm honored to be part of this panel, to be able to moderate it. I've been asked to give a very brief introduction to the topic and to the speakers. This panel is exciting because it relates to the theme of the conference. So 2023 marks the 50th anniversary of Skylab, the first United States space station. This anniversary inspired the theme for our conference this year, which is Islands in Space from Skylab to Gateway. One thing that struck me as I thought about the theme was how the Apollo program showed us definitively that humans could reach the moon and return home safely, and that we could do important science on the moon, which could not be done on Earth. But it was limited in the fact that the astronauts had so little time on the surface. So after Apollo, the next big goal was to create more of a sustained off-world presence, which would allow in-depth exploration, as well as the possibility of reaching deep space destinations. And to make this goal viable, scientific investigation was required. To learn how humans can safely live long-term without the protections of the Earth's biosphere, atmosphere, magnetosphere, etc. And low Earth orbit is a vital next step. It provides the environment to do a testing environment that's close to home and that is realistic for the space environment. And Skylab and later the ISS have played a key role in preparing us for Artemis, Gateway, and everything that will follow. So in this panel, we are going to focus on Skylab. We're going to focus on the knowledge gained from the biomedical research that was performed on Skylab. And we have two very distinguished speakers with us today, Professor Dorn and Dr. Allen. We're very happy to have you with us. Thanks for joining us. I'm just going to give a quick introduction to our first speaker, which is Charles Dorn. He served as a director of UC's Space Research Institute for Discovery and Exploration in the Office of Research. And in addition, he is a research professor in the Department of Environmental and Public Health Sciences. He has also served as the Division Director of Public Health Sciences and the MPH Program Director in the Division of Public Health, DEPHS University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. He also has academic appointments as a full professor in political science at UC, in aerospace medicine at Wright State University, and in emergency medicine at George Washington University. He currently provides subject matter expertise in aerospace medicine to NASA's Chief Health and Medical Officer and serves as the co-chair of the Federal Telehealth Working Group for the U.S. government. Dorn has worked closely with NATO, the Department of Defense, and the Department of State as a Fulbright specialist. And as the editor-in-chief of the Telemedicine and eHealth Journal since 2005, Dorn is a recognized leader in telemedicine and telehealth as a scholar and teacher, having published 7 books, over 450 manuscripts, editorials, federal reports, and 46 book chapters. Dorn is an editor of the 4th edition of Space Physiology and Medicine, From Evidence to Practice, which is a seminal text. He's an editor of a multinational telemedicine system for disaster response, opportunities and challenges, and an editor of Engineering, Life Sciences, and Health Medicine Synergy in Aerospace Human Systems Integration, the Rosetta Stone Project, and Telemedicine, Telehealth, and Telepresence, Principles, Strategies, Applications, and New Directions. He is an amazing person and incredibly distinguished scholar and teacher, and we're so happy to have him here with us on this panel. So Professor Dorn, I'll let you go ahead with your presentation.
It almost sounds, every time you read it, it sounds like an obituary. So I'm going to start kind of with a historical background of how do we get to where we are today. And if we look back into the late 40s at the end of World War II and into the 1950s, we really didn't have a whole lot of understanding of what we're about to talk about. And let me see if my slides will advance. Okay, so in the early 1950s, well, the term space medicine came from Hubertus Strughold at the end of 1949. He was at a scientific meeting. He came up with that term, and so that stuck, but Hubertus Strughold did not stick because he was affiliated with the Nazi regime. And so in the 1940s and 50s, there were small rockets, and we launched primate. Well, I didn't. I wasn't born yet. They were launched primates and small other small animals into space on rockets to see what would happen to them. Then we had a couple of manned missions on the ground, And I think an earlier panel discussion you heard during the conference was about analogs. And I think Dr. Nikogosian talked about Mars 500, which is in the Institute of Biomedical Problems in Moscow. And then we have Joe Kittinger in the lower right corner, jumping out of this gondola at about 103,000 feet. His core temperature was 108 degrees, which most human beings can't survive that, but that's the temperature post-flight analysis of his body temperature. During the mission, there was no monitoring of him physiologically. And even in the military, there was no monitoring of a human being during that those first flights. And in fact, the military didn't start really using telemedicine until 1991. And that was in Somalia. Okay, so at the time, in this early part of the 1950s, this actually comes from 1960 cover of Time magazine. You see there were a number of questions were unanswered at that time. We've answered some of these questions to date in low Earth orbit and on a moon mission, but not on Mars mission. And so the question, and I don't have to read them all, but you can take a look at them. How can we eat? And if we eat, how can we go to the bathroom? What does acceleration do to our bodies? Can we survive in space? And so many of these questions require a robust research portfolio. And the point I wanted to make here, and I'll use this little arrow that appears here, this black arrow, is the United States and the Soviet Union, mostly Russia, really approached space exploration differently. And in fact, most of the understanding of aerospace medicine or space medicine in the 1950s was done by the United States Air Force. And they had a program called Bioastronautics and the Exploration of Space. This is a front cover of that report. I couldn't find a higher quality cover, a higher quality photograph. And the one on the right is a monograph developed by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, on Russia's ability to do space medicine. So as an aside, after the Gemini mission, Dr. Charles Berry went to a meeting in Prague, gave a presentation about the results of Gemini, which were a lot of biomedical tests done. And the Russian/Soviet scientists were very excited about what they heard, but also were concerned that the United States was being too open, and they had no idea what they were talking. The Russians had no idea what they were talking about. So they, Dr. Berry, according to Dr. Berry, went back to his room. About an hour later, there was a knock at the door, and two men in suits asked him if they would come with him to a meeting in the lower bowels of this castle, which is where the meeting was. And they went down there, and a picture of this long hallway, at the very long end of the long hallway was a Soviet soldier with a machine gun. And in behind the door was all this laughter and talking and, gregarious discussions. And the door opened and all the smoke billowed out and the vodka bottles were laying on the table, and it was dead silence. And they said, Dr. Berry, please come in. We'd like you to come to Moscow and teach us about space medicine. And he said, like forever, or just for like a couple of lectures? Oh, no, just for a couple of lectures. So he didn't say anything to anybody. Didn't tell his wife, didn't tell the center director at the Johnson Manned Spacecraft Center at the time. He didn't tell anybody. So Sam Poole, one of Dr. Allen and I, one of our colleagues, happened to be sitting outside the office in 1969. And two men from the FBI showed up and said, Dr. Berry, we'd like to talk to you about your recent meeting in Prague. You mean the science meeting? He goes, no, the meeting with the Soviet scientists. So clearly there was somebody spying. And so they approached the Nixon administration about creating a joint working group between the United States and the USSR. And Nixon said no. Nixon then went to China, came back from China, and then he said yes. And the Apollo-Soyuz test project was the first element of that interaction between the United States and the Soviet Union/Russia. And today, the foundation of medical care, medical operations is based on that first mission way back in 1975. So we had limited knowledge in the 1960s on both sides of the ocean. We had an intense competition about getting to the moon. That's what Kennedy's speech in 1961, a 62 time period, was we're going to get to the moon by the end of the decade. And how are we going to do that? So pre-Skylab, we had remember, two different approaches. There's the approach that the United States took, which was short duration missions, and the approach that the Russians took, which is long duration missions. Long duration meaning space stations. And we didn't have a space station. We had visionary ideas of space station, but we had Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. We landed on the moon, and then somebody decided we weren't going to do that anymore. And we had 5 or 6 Saturn V rockets left. 2 of them are on display, one in Houston and one at the Marshall Space Flight Center. Or maybe it's at the Kennedy Space Center, excuse me. And the other ones were then used for Skylab missions and for the Apollo-Soyuz. The Russians, on the other hand, had Vostok, Vashkod, and Soyuz, and their first space station was called Almaz, which is a DOS, or Durable Orbital Space Station, and then the Salyut missions, where people would live for long periods of time. And so if you think about the operational tempo, there was 2 different approaches: short duration, NASA, United States; long duration, the Soviet Union, Russia. And so the question that comes up is, how do you monitor the crew? How do you support the crew with communications and so forth? So in the United States, we had a really robust telecommunications network that spanned the entire world, except over the zone of exclusion, which is in the Indian Ocean. On the Russian side, or the Soviet side, they only can talk to the capsule when it's over the Soviet Union territory, some of Eastern Europe, Mongolia, maybe northern parts of China, but that's all. They can't communicate with the space station or their rockets or their crew when they're not over that land. They didn't have the wide distribution. So in the lower, or in the middle of this slide, you see a dog inside of a device that was then put on the top of an intercontinental ballistic missile. This is Laika. This was on Sputnik 2, and the Russians actually monitored this dog for a period of time. The dog was supposed to be in space for several weeks, maybe several, well, probably, I think it was like 9 or 10 days, maybe almost 2 weeks, but it didn't survive very long. And so they were able to monitor the animal. And then they sent another dog up, Belka, and John and I have seen Belka actually on display in Dr. Guzenko's office in Moscow at the Institute of Biomedical Problems. So the Space Task Group, which is a follow-on from the old NACA, before NASA was created, actually laid out the systems to actually monitor astronauts. And these, and Alan Shepard, you see in the picture with the patches on his chest, were developed right here at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, in the late 50s. So the post-Apollo program, Werner von Braun came up with this hand-drawn document of what the Skylab mission might look like. And you can see on the right side, the actual launch gantry on the mover at the Launch Pad 39A back right before launch. There were 3 human-intended missions, Skylab 2, 3, and 4. And the first physician in space was Dr. Joseph Kerwin. The space station was brought down when I was a senior in high school in 1975, and it was it came apart. Parts of it landed in in Australia, but the rest of it is down in the ocean. So we now jump into, in those early missions, there's not a lot of movement. So, and I'll show you a photograph of me standing next to a Soyuz spacecraft, very small. I'm not small, but the spacecraft is small. And so there's not a lot of room to move around, do a lot of research. So with Gemini, there was a little more room, but then when we get to Skylab, we had an enormous amount of room. So we were able to do a lot more life sciences work, a lot more medical monitoring, exercise. There are videos you can see of the astronauts running around in a circle. The volume was greatly increased. And so we were able to begin to looking at some of these things on this chart. You obviously see the human and the systems, human systems on the right, but we began to develop many of the things you see on the left, of which telemedicine was a major part of that. Now, in the build-up to this program, the Nixon administration was very interested in how technology in the space program could be helpful to the overall community at large. How can the taxpayer money be beneficial for Earth applications? And if you've seen the movie First Man, which is a movie about Neil Armstrong, there's a scene in there where there's a lot of African Americans at a campground near the Kennedy Space Center. And they were chanting, this is the historical record. In the movie, it's probably embellished a little bit, but they were saying, you know, we're starving and Whitey's going to the moon. We're starving and Whitey's going to the moon. So the Nixon administration wanted to make sure that this technology found its way into the average life of an American citizen. So they created this program called Emblems, Integrated Medical and Behavioral Laboratory Measurement System, which was a eventually development for the Skylab medical kits, and then the space shuttle came out. The space shuttle was designed in the late 60s, early 70s, but didn't fly until 1981. So in the left-hand corner, you see the desert, the Sonora Desert in Arizona, which is where StarPack was held. And you on the right side, you can see the medical kit, which was a very large rack of equipment, much more robust than even on the current space station. This is the vehicle that began to develop telemedicine in the 1970s. This vehicle lasted until the early 1980s, but it was funded in part by NASA, part by Lockheed, the Indian Health Service. And they really began to look at wireless technology. They began to look at optical storage of data. This is something Sam Poole was involved in early on. And so this then began to develop the ability for us to monitor crew members in space. This just highlights the mission profiles. You can see the very first one was SMEET. And if you want to look at this website, you can find out more information. There's videos and everything there. But Skylab 2 is the one where we had the first physician, Dr. Joe Kerwin, and it was 28 days. 60 days was the second mission, and then 84 days. So 84 days was the longest we had until we had people living on Mir in the 1990s. And these are the mission patches. The results were published in a book called, interesting enough, Biomedical Results of Skylab. And you can see there was a lot of adaptation in space environment. When you go to space for the first few days, you may feel like you want to vomit, space motion sickness. You may be constipated. You may not be able to urinate. You may not be able to eat well. But over time, you begin to adapt. And after you adapt in space, then you have to readapt to come back to the Earth. And you can't just come back after spending a year in space and expect to walk around your spacecraft. You have to do the countermeasures and understand the impact on the vestibular system, the cardiovascular system, and so forth. And so we learned a lot from the Skylab about the things that would then help us with both space station and the International Space Station program. So here's just a couple of pictures in the lower right-hand corner. You can see me, a younger me, standing next to a Soyuz module. This is how big the Soyuz module is. And imagine 3 people inside where the green couch is, right to the right, I guess to my right or to the left on the photograph. It's 3 people in there and being brought back because the mission is over. Or what if the person was injured and that's the only way home? And these are just pictures of inside the Skylab where you see Dr. Kerwin is doing an oral examination on another crew member. You can see the crew member taking a shower. You can see the other crew members lifting weights, doing exercises because there's no weight. It's kind of weightless. So we learned a lot about transportation, the expand volume, and the hygiene. Those were really things we learned a lot about because in the earlier missions, they were really confined quarters and really couldn't do a lot. The pathway to ISS, obviously, we expanded the medical care capability. We understood a lot more about what happened to the astronaut in space. We were able to then understand the psychological impact, the exercise countermeasures and so forth, the physiological impact. And you can see how this then led us to what we now call the International Space Station. And if you think about that, and there's only a few more slides, is that when Skylab was a very small space station, we had a lot of volume. The International Space Station is enormous. It's about the size of a football field in any sport, on any campus or any soccer field in the world. That's how big it is. And so the habitable volume and the ability to do research is enormous in size. Gateway, Artemis, not so much. It's going to be back in my cubicle I'm sitting in, not that big. It's probably going to be a little bigger than that. And so to do more research on a Mars mission is going to take a lot more volume and a lot more capability. There's been a number of publications. You can see a list here. Again, it's just on a partial list, but you can see they range in difference in disciplines. And so it's not just about the development of medical care or microbiological sampling. It actually covers a wide variety of disciplines. I put this slide in to reiterate the fact that it's a crowded field now. We have the FAA, the NTSB beginning to develop policy on commercial flight. You see in the upper right-hand corner, Richard Branson and Virgin Galactic. You see in the middle, even Captain Kirk got to fly in space finally with Jeff Bezos. And those two companies basically take you up and bring you down. And there's a debate in Washington whether they should actually be called astronauts or not. Just because you go above the Kármán line doesn't necessarily mean you're the same as a John Glenn or Neil Armstrong or Buzz Aldrin or whoever it might be. And on the left is a picture from Apollo 17. This is actually the cardiac rhythm of an astronaut done by telemedicine. You can actually see he was having some challenges, not significant, but it's just an observation that was made actually during the mission. This is the Rosetta Stone. I wanted to just highlight the Rosetta Stone. Obviously, is the one written in different languages on the left slide, but you can see in the cover of the book, the astronaut is in the middle, and the astronaut is influenced by engineers, by life scientists, and by aerospace medicine physicians or health and medical. And a lot of times when you don't have those three in concert, bad things happen. One might be a poor design of a oxygen generation system for the F-22. One might be the poor design of a spacesuit. And so all these things become very important, and human systems integration and health and medical technical authority are really the foundation now of how Dr. J.D. Polk, who you'll hear from tomorrow, will interact with the engineering community to make sure that our systems are safe and that we can live and work on a platform this large, but a platform with Artemis and Gateway even smaller. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating overview of how we got to where we are now and the lessons learned and important research that's been done. We have a few minutes. I don't know if there are any questions, but we have a few minutes if people have questions before we go on to the next talk. And I think I will take advantage of the fact that I'm the moderator and I have the microphone, so to speak, to ask the first question. I was really intrigued by the statement that the Nixon administration was so interested and put such a high priority on showing the value of the space program for vulnerable and disenfranchised populations. And I just curious, in your opinion, how well were they able to do that? Do you think that they achieved that goal? Do you see that in space exploration today, or how far do we still have to go?
I think, well, an aside, because I'm taking a course towards a PhD. Whether I do it or not, I don't know. And John and I talked about that. But the book was about COVID. And I just wrote my question to tomorrow's seminar that I'm going to be participating in. And the question is, technology, specifically telemedicine and a vaccine, has been developed in less than 18 months. So we as public we have this insatiable desire for technology, and we want it now. But when it comes to telemedicine, I've had 6 deans at the medical school I work at, 20 years now, said, we don't need telemedicine. We have all the docs. We have all the physicians we need right here on Pill Hill in Cincinnati. And so a lot of the things, and there's still a lot of people who are disenfranchised, whether it's because of sexual orientation, whether it's because of race, whether it's ableism, which is a new term I learned just in this course. And you have many people who look at the space program as an awesome way for our country to move forward. But they also, I think, begin to say, well, maybe we could use that money for something else. Now, we all know that the space race of the 1960s led us to amazing technologies, computers. Yeah, you could say Velcro and Tang and all that other stuff, right? I mean, we know this. And NASA has done a great job of spinning out technology. But if it wasn't for that investment, I'm not sure we'd be in the position we are today to have responded to a pandemic. I mean, even Dr. Polk's group over the last couple of years actually worked on developing ventilators and provided that technology. So the spinoff is amazing, but the downside of not doing any of this is you become second or third or fourth place. I mean, do you really think the average American is going to sit back and go, I don't care if India landed on the south side of the moon or not. However, if they now start mining it, they start screwing around with the stuff we left there. Now you're going to start seeing people going, we need more money for NASA. We need to do more exploration. So there's another space race coming, right? There's a whole reason why Space Force even exists, because the danger in space is a lot more significant and severe than I think the average American citizen understands.
Very well said. Thank you. And
Kristen?
I was going to say, John, you came off of Mike. Did you want to add on to that?
Yeah, let me just real quick to your question. Early on in my career with NASA, I was with one of the senior space operations leaders, and I was mentioning the same kind of thing. It's like, I don't understand why we never hear anything on the television about all the great stuff that NASA's doing. You hear these advertisements, like the Army had the logo of an army of one, Air Force had like aim high, all that kind of stuff, And he says, John, you don't understand. That's recruiting. First off, NASA have no problem with recruiting. But further, we also don't have any authority to advertise our accomplishments. Now, NASA has put together documents, spin-off books, and websites that say, here's all the spin-offs, here's the things that we've done. Well, you got to get people to that. If they don't know about it, they're never going to see it to begin with. So that's still a challenge for NASA.
Now, I will say, there's a TV program, I don't know when it's going to happen, but it's on the BBC and it's on CNN, and it's about Columbia. If you've never, for those in the audience that are listening, looks like there's like 38 or so, I don't know. If you've ever been to the Kennedy Space Center, in the VAB, the Vehicle Assembly Building, which is the largest building in the world, is on the 22nd floor, is not all, some of the remains of Columbia. And so they study that, so they review that. And so Michael Centinelli, who's the person who runs that museum piece, if you will, it's not really a museum, they're going to shut it down because of the toxins, the toxic hazards, the gases and so forth that are in the vehicle assembly building the rockets. So they're going to move it somewhere. They don't know where yet, but they came in with a film crew, the CNN and BBC, to actually film this idea. Now, the interesting thing is that Jeff Bezos has been in there. Richard Branson has been in there. Who do you think has not been in there? Right. And an aside, just real quick, maybe you know this. In 1949, Werner von Braun wrote a book on living and working on Mars. Right. It's 1949. And all that colony on Mars is under the control of one man. You know what that man's name is? Elon.
Really?
I dropped the mic.
Oh, that's awesome. All right, on that note, thank you so much, Charles. That was a fantastic presentation. I really appreciate it. And a great start to the panel. And I think we'll move on to our second speaker, Dr. John Allen. Dr. Allen served as the program executive for crew health and safety at NASA headquarters and as a liaison to the chief medical officer. He served for 26 years in the Air Force as a clinical audiologist, a research scientist, and a biomedical specialist with an emphasis in hearing and balance disorders, retiring in 2006 at the rank of colonel. He worked closely with his health and human performance colleagues to establish the space requirements for overall crew health for the Artemis program. Dr. Allen retired from NASA in 2023 and is currently working with Star Harbor to establish medical standards for commercial spaceflight and to develop a campus in Colorado for commercial space training. And he'll be talking to us today about Skylab habitability and the ISS crew health. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as with Professor Doran, I'll try to keep this succinct, so if there are some questions at the end. But what I'd like to do, and make sure, first off, that my slides are going to advance here. And it doesn't seem to be on my end.
We are still seeing the title slide here.
Yep, so am I. Let me go back out. Stop
Okay.
sharing.
That's where you say, Houston, we have a problem.
Right.
Let me try this. And seeing the slides now, there we go. Are those advancing now?
They are now, yeah.
Okay.
Great.
So again, I wanted to put in here that my disclaimer here that these are my opinions. Those are not these are not the opinions of NASA nor of Star Harbor. And you know, along with that, there's no financial compensation, darn it, from any place that would go along with this as well. But I wanted to start out talking about human exploration, and this may look like a phrase you've seen before in some movies a long time ago, a long time ago. So I would like to come at this whole discussion about Skylab, and I've been asked to discuss some things with respect to habitability and the environmental control and systems that came along with Skylab and where we've gone with that. But before I do that, fortunately, we can do this virtually. Unfortunately, we can't be physically together because it's a whole lot easier to interact. What I'm going to do is ask you to participate in this to some extent, because you've got access to the chat or question and answer. I'd like you to work along with me on this and say, okay, has there ever been a time that you have traveled somewhere in a particular vehicle, gone to a particular location, realized that what you did was either you were unprepared for it, there were things you didn't know about it, flat out turned out to be a disaster? If there are, and you feel like sharing those with me, just let me know and put those in the chat or in the Q&A portion. But I wanted to share with you a long time ago something that I did, a couple of different somethings. One of which was when I was a young kid and I used to go camping with the Boy Scouts. My first tent was an old pup tent, and those are still out there. But if anybody's been camping in one of these, one of the things you first learn is when you go camping and it starts to rain, the last thing you do is touch the inside of the canvas. Because then all of a sudden you've broken down the integrity of that system. Now you've got a drip tube coming down and flooding your tent. Or as my son learned when he was camping, same kind of situation back in Texas as a child. If you know Texas or in the South where there are fire ants, you know what you don't do is pitch your tent over top of a fire ant hill, as several of the kids in the class in his scout group had done. Then you wind up not being able to live in your tent and have to find somewhere else to sleep. So these are things that you do where you learn along the way, you make some mistakes. But so as you learn from that, I learned. So as I got a little older, my parents moved to a place where they had sold their house out from under themselves. They needed to find some place to live quickly. So my dad rented a quote unquote mobile home, set it up on the property. And it was really cool, except that we had no electricity. We had no running water. We used kerosene lanterns that, you know, all of my schoolwork was over when the lantern ran out of fuel. Finally got a generator going, and the generator would last for a while and it would run out of gas. Got water hooked up to it at one point in time and then found out that every pipe inside of it leaked. So that was a rather unique experience for all of us. Excuse me, why do I bring this up? Because along the way, you learn either rightly or wrongly, you learn what mistakes you've made. You hopefully make adjustments to those. And then you take those lessons learned and you apply them to things that you can do later on. Or in many cases, it's lessons forgotten. You learned all this kind of stuff, period of time goes by, all of a sudden you're in a new situation, like building a new spacecraft, and you have forgotten all about those things that were written down somewhere along the way. And Professor Dorn is one of the great archivists of those kinds of lessons, and has reams, you've heard all the publications that he has, reams and reams of documents about the kinds of things that have been done, particularly from a space medicine perspective, but also operationally. So when you have that kind of experience, that all impacts on what I refer to as habitability. And so it's more than the environmental control and life sciences system, systems like the ECLIS portions. It has to do with, yes, is there water available? Yes, is there food available? But it also has to do with habitability. That is there a place to eat? Is there a place to sleep? Is there a place to relax? Can you wash up at some point in time? And Chuck showed you the shower that was available on Skylab. Is there a place to get rid of that food that you took on? And what about friends and family? Is there an opportunity to visit with them at some point in time that adds to your behavioral health components? And is there a purpose really to what you're doing? Are you just going to explore, or is there a purpose there? Each one of these, if you tease them apart, you could take food, for example, and if you look back through Skylab documents, there's a whole treatise on how we went through the process, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a bit, but what kind of foods were going to be available, how were we going to make those available, how they were going to be, what kind of food was there, were we going to stick with the same kind of things that we used when in Gemini, Mercury, Apollo, where most of the food was for short periods of time, was in some kind of a tube, you could squeeze it out and take it in. From a habitability standpoint, that's probably not an effective approach. From a functional operational standpoint, get the job done portion, yeah, that would be fine. But if you're going up on Skylab or space station or whatever, and you're going to be up there for not for just a few days, but for months at a time, then that is going to diminish the habitability of the entire experience and really could result in significant impacts on the mission. Places to sleep. There's not just a place to sleep, but where is it located? And I'll talk a bit about that more as well. Places to relax. You saw exercise equipment was available on Skylab. Okay, but was that actually a relaxation portion, or was that something that was just there for a particular purpose of getting the exercise in? Is there a place for you to visit with your family and friends so that it adds to the relaxation portion? So when Skylab was first conceived, there was not necessarily, in fact, there was no consideration initially of habitability until a specific study was done. There was a lot of fighting between the Manned Space Flight Center, ultimately Johnson Space Center, and Marshall Space Flight Center, to how things were going to be produced. And there's lots of documentation about conversations that took place all the way from headquarters down to the centers as to how are you going to make this facility and how is it going to work for individuals. Well, the first concept was to do a wet laboratory. And the wet laboratory meant simply, you saw that picture that Chuck showed you with the rocket, the Saturn V rocket, and on top of that was Skylab ready to go to space. Well, Skylab was a converted portion of a vehicle, of a rocket fuel tank. The first approach was to say, why don't we just configure it like it's going to be internally without all the stuff, and we'll just use it as a fuel tank. And after all the fuel is burned off, we can just leave it up there, and then we can go up later, and we can then convert it over to being a space station. That view, fortunately, was not one that lasted terribly long. It lasted longer than people like to admit, but lasted terribly long because I don't know about you, but from a habitability standpoint, there would always be that, if not real, perceived smell of rocket fuel still lining the inside of that laboratory and basically your living environment. So they finally went to a dry lab where it was an empty shell that was sent up there. And then they had to take all the rest of it up to outfit it. Even though that was laborious, it was easier to launch the empty shell, took less fuel consumption to get it up there. Yes, you had to take things up later and then outfit it. But it certainly led to the ability to build what was a more habitable environment. I think everybody agreed by the time they got done with those decisions. Give you an idea, the 3 cluster modules that put together that show the Skylab, which I'll show you here in just a minute, 150 times larger than Mercury, 60 times larger on the internal space than the Apollo command module. So that's a considerable increase, even though it is, as Chuck said, significantly smaller than the space station. But the early spacecraft design was designed, as I suggested earlier, for operations. Let's get the job done. Let's not worry about it so much as a habitat. Well, there were discussions for long periods of time about how can we make it more habitable. Gemini 10, according to Michael Collins, was approximately the size of a Volkswagen Bug sitting in the front seat of that. And if anybody's ever sat in one of those, which I used to own, that's not a lot of space. The Space Station Symposium in 1960 that was held barely mentioned anything about making the space station comfortable, even though there had been discussions about habitability. Out of all the papers presented in 1960, one or two had anything to do with how you're going to make it more comfortable and a better living space for the astronauts. So I got this quote out of the Living and Working in Space, a History of Skylab from NASA. Habitability or livability or whatever the name is given to the suitability of the environment for daily living is, as one NASA designer remarked, a nebulous term at best, not one not usually found in the engineer's vocabulary. This goes back to what Chuck was talking about as far as the Rosetta Stone. It's getting that conversation going between the life sciences people, the medical people, and the engineers to where they keep that astronaut at the center of that design to try to make things more habitable. So what are those habitability kinds of things? Well, engineers are used to dealing with things like the composition and temperature of the atmosphere where the astronauts are. They're used to looking at levels of lighting and noise. Although I will say, as an audiologist and my early on exposure with NASA and the construction of the space station, even though they built requirements in for how loud things should be, as you started putting together one module or one payload that barely met the requirements, pushed the limits, with another module that barely met the requirements, by the time you started getting those together, it wound up exceeding some of those requirements and those had to be dealt with later. Pumps and air and fans on board the space station over the years have had to be retrofit to make them quieter. And they brought down the noise levels considerably on the space station. But things like ease of keeping house, who's going to do that and how's it going to get done? Ease of attending to personal hygiene. How simple can it be to actually wash yourself and keep clean? The provisions for exercise were not one of those things that engineers, okay, I can build you an exercise piece of equipment, but I'm not really thinking about it in terms of what's it going to do for you in terms of keeping you in physical shape, unless you give me requirements for that. But even with that, they had lots of problems with a cycle ergometer that was initially built for Skylab. Provisions for off-duty exercise. The thoughts of, okay, this has got to meet certain requirements for exercise, but what about somebody wants to use it when they're not, when it's not required specifically for the operations portion? And provisions for eating. Well, we provided food for you. Okay, that's fine. But there's a whole lot of other factors that go into how do you make that eating situation better for the individual, more conducive to long-term stay in an isolated and confined environment. And so as you move longer and longer into missions, these things and many, many more from a habitability standpoint become issues that are a challenge for the engineering community. I mean, at points, if you wanted to make an engineer uncomfortable, mention a soft, squishy thing that has to go inside that space station. The military has had that same situation. Build an airplane, no problem. Build an airplane that is easily functional for the pilot, different challenge. So this is really what the Skylab looked like. You can see starting from the top of the screen down to the bottom, there's three basic components to it. But you see where it says wardroom, waste compartment, work experiments. That's really where the astronauts spent the bulk of their time. And as Chuck said, much larger than they had been exposed to when they were in Apollo. So a lot more room to move around in. In fact, there's so much room that down the center portion of which was their workstation or the work area, they had originally built a pole that went from one end to the other because they were concerned that the astronauts would get out away from the wall and not be able to move anywhere, so that they would have the pole out there to grab hold of it to then propel themselves from one side to the other. Well, as it turns out, with Skylab 1, the astronauts learned very quickly that that was not necessary. Just push off the side, you're going to go where you want to go. So they took the pole out. And then when they got finished with their mission, they very judiciously put it back in place. Same thing for Skylab 2, same thing for Skylab 3. So they're really good about putting things back, but they really didn't need it. But all of these different sections were not only had to be developed, but had to be developed so that they were in a manner that could work best for the astronauts. And so when you look at the different levels on this, they're laid out, and there's a very nice mock example of this at Space Center Houston, where you can go in and see what the module looks like. So that part of this is set up so that it looks like a regular floor as you sit down at a desk or something like that and work. Whereas the other is built around sort of the circumference of the Skylab, realizing that you could take advantage of a lot of different space. And I'll mention this more than once, Skylab was the experiment. It was the experiment to see how could people live in space for long periods of time and what really was necessary. And this gives you a good idea of a mock-up looking down at how those things were configured around that circular body and how to make best use of it. At the top is the exercise device, but you've got all these different components arranged around the edges of it and trying to figure out what works best for them. And the problem is with microgravity, you could be working someplace, go to, normally at your desk, you'd set something down and be there, but this could float away and you're like, okay, where to go? And with that mesh type of floor, many things could vanish and be picked up probably later in the ventilation system as it sucks that up. So from a habitability standpoint, the engineers have to think about, are you just engineering it or are you designing it? Are you moving forward in a manner that makes this not only functional, but appealing and physically comfortable? So looking at the physical layout and building a mock-up like the one you just saw is a brilliant way to do that. That is done on a routine basis these days, so that you can not only figure out, let's say from the medical standpoint, where you're working on, or a research standpoint, you're working on a particular aspect of research. What you don't want is that all the materials that you need for it, or some critical portion, you have to go to the other end of the station to get it, if you can find it, or even across the station to get it. It should be laid out in an intelligent fashion that is accessible. So there are lots of things to consider as you go through the construction of these. And there was effort made in that direction in Skylab, but there were still failures in that direction. And NASA has continued to try to work in that direction, as well as the commercial space sector. So the problem is that it's like the where is it thing. I said, you got to find the tool. You got to figure out, is the tool convenient? Can I reach it? If it's nearby, can I actually reach it? Or do I have to like disconnect myself from my toe holds to go fly over to get something? And then furthermore, can I operate it when I find it? Because that's one of the other aspects is, if you've been trained months before about how things function, are you going to be able to remember all of that by the time you get on space station in the Skylab or any space station? Or furthermore, if it's been so long since you've seen it, do you even know what it is? And then how it works? And so you see the astronauts around the table here, they're in the galley. Well, that's in the mock-up. So that's getting some examples of how they might be gathering around. But it may still is not the same thing as when you're in microgravity. How you're functioning at a work table, where can you put your toes to hold you in place? Things of that sort have to come into play. And then can you reach all the switches and all the knobs and all the gadgets that you need? And you can see here that one of the other improvements, just like Chuck with telemedicine, our television capabilities have improved dramatically. This is a camera taking a picture in a mock-up. This was the cameras of that same crew. As they're on board Skylab. Fortunately, the ability to monitor them is much, much better these days. But part of what they have to get used to is the things like, another portion of the habitability is, here's your personal effects. Are your personal effects kept in a manner that you can access them easily? They worked very hard on Skylab for that, but also had to contain them. So they, constructed some things that were new, but some things are, dyed in the wool. There's a toothbrush is a toothbrush. But then how do you get the toothpaste onto the brush and keep it there without it floating away? So a lot of things to consider. Food was a major one. This is the warming tray. You saw it in the previous picture. A lot of research went into this. And a lot of that research that was accomplished to get something where you could have warm meals and drinks that you could control was further advanced as we went into space station, is now being looked at again differently, perhaps differently by the commercial sector. Doing something like taking a shower sounded like a really good idea until you got into the situation of, where does the water go? How do you contain it? How hard is it to set up the system? is it easier to just, as we do on space station now, just get wipes and clean yourself off? So it's not so much as that we did things wrong as we had to learn. And that's why I said, and we'll say again, that Skylab was a great experiment to find out how things might work. And then as Chuck showed this picture before, whether it's weightlifting or just goofing around, and keeping in mind that there are things that need to be done there for behavioral health to try to make life on board someplace a lot more entertaining. And one aspect, the quote Sir Elton John, it's just my job 5 days a week. By and large, that's what the astronauts are keeping to on space station. That's what they tried to do with Skylab, is to control the amount of time individuals are involved in all the work, giving them some time to either do additional research or science that they wanted to do, or look out the windows or have a good time, and make that, again, from a behavioral health standpoint, a more habitable environment. And the other part, this is Gibson's family back on Earth. His ability to communicate was through that, what looks like a wall radio behind him. So there wasn't that capability to have the video conferences that they do now. That's critically important to be able to keep in touch with the crews and make that whole long-term trip a much more habitable and enjoyable one. This was when they were building the mock-up, and you can see that there's a lot to that mock-up. Whether it was going to be from the wet lab standpoint or the dry lab standpoint, there's a lot of turf. This is like one of those things that looks like your house when you first move in and there's no furniture. I got tons of space. This was 20+ feet across. You could fit all kinds of stuff in there until you start fitting all kinds of stuff in there. And so then you have to think in terms of what's the best way to make that work. And that's really where the new explorers come in. First off, from the explorer standpoint, the ones that are going to be in the commercial exploration, as Chuck said, whether they're actually get that designation as astronaut or not, I'm not worrying about that. But will they be fit to fly? And if they are, who says? And what will they want or demand of that environment in which they're working? It could be a lot different. There may be greater demands when you're paying that much money. And how will the environment impact them? Will it have the same impact for a group of individuals who are not going to be necessarily in the same physical and behavioral health condition of the astronauts themselves, the government astronauts? We talked about cleaning house. Will they clean house? Will they figure, I'm paying all this money, I don't have to do that? Will they conduct science? Most likely some will. And I think that's a large component for the commercial industry, is to have science conducted in space, but who's going to do that? Will they, and back to Chuck's comments about, contributions and the question about contributions back to Earth, will they contribute? So far, it looks like that's the intent for the individuals who have flown, is try to make that what they do in some way meaningful back to Earth. And what will they expect? I was talking about food and entertainment. Is this going to be something much more elaborate, or are they going to be willing to get by? Will they endure beyond short missions? And will they want longer ones? If the longer ones are going to be the same conditions as the short ones, or lots of questions. So what did Skylab teach us? It told us about commercial space operators versus it's not just operations, it is about living and existing in space. It taught government space program managers that we need to think of a whole lot of other kinds of things to make the system habitable. Space systems designers had to learn a whole new way of designing. Engineers had to think of a whole new language and understand that. Some are really good at that and are much, much better than before. But space medicine personnel also need to learn the engineering side of the house so they can explain themselves better as to why those requirements are important. And I'll leave here of, again, another quote from David Bowie. Here am I floating in my tin can, because you can see how big that space was in the middle of the area of Skylab, and why they might be concerned that they couldn't get from one side to the other. And with that, I will end. And if I've left any time for questions, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was a really, really fascinating presentation and really interesting look at some of the important questions that Skylab has helped us to address that I think we are still addressing and still working out. I was thinking as you were speaking about, the interplay between engineering and, the human factors, medical interplay. I think there's a third part to it from the science side of things. I think, that as a scientist, you get so excited about having people in this space and all the things they can do. And, you just want to pack every productive moment in there that you possibly can. And you have to balance that, with the life aspect and with the human factors aspect as well. And it makes such a big difference. We saw that in Skylab, and we certainly see that in the ISS as well. It's an important balance to find, with all the each side having its own agenda, and where do you find the way to cooperate and to make sure everybody gets some but not all of what they want, I guess, out of that. It's a great
I think the challenge there is that the individuals that are flying on NASA missions are paid by NASA, or in some cases military. They have an option of which research to do. They have an option to do it. They do not have an option not to do it. Commercial flyers, like, hey, I paid $1 million. I'm just going to sit my butt here and look out the window. And now there was a guy up in Dayton, Ohio, last name Cooper. He's one of the guys that flew on the SpaceX mission that did not dock with a space station. If you don't dock with a space station, the requirements for you to fly are different. And so they said, well, we're going to do research. I don't know what kind of research they did. It's not led by NASA. It's not led by a university. So it'd be interesting to see. The only other point I wanted to make that I forgot to mention is that, and John showed a picture of the Skylab, there was a mishap on that mission where the solar panel was damaged. And so one of the things I'm working on with Dr. Polk and as a headquarters is a mishap manual. How do you train people, specifically flight surgeons, how do you respond to a mishap investigation? And we have a very robust system within NASA to do that. The FAA has that. The NTSB, has that, but commercial providers do not. And so we're at the very early stage of commercial space flight, 10, 15 years now. And when we were all little, I mean, I know when I was little, I never thought in my wildest imagination there would be companies sending people into space that were not under an American or a Soviet Union flag, or now, of course, India, China, and so forth. So clearly the playing field is different, and the research that we're going to need is most likely going to be done by some 7-year-old who will get his or her PhD at maybe APUS in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And those people are the ones who are going to discover and develop things that we can only imagine today.
It's a very good point. It's a very good point. I think that the commercial entrance into space has been one of the biggest revolutions, and it's going to be fascinating to see where that goes. I saw someone raise a hand. I think you can come on, Mike, if you have a question. Is that possible? Or you can type in the chat if not. But if you're able to, you're welcome to ask a question.
I noticed nobody was brave enough to type in their travel failures.
Well, there are two comments about somebody wants to re-engineer the LMS starting from you. That's a good idea because most of the plans were thrown out. And the other thing is, can we provide these are the slides supposed to be made available, Kristen? Are we supposed to?
Oh,
I mean, do people want them? Or I know it's being taped, but
it is being recorded. I know that they make the recordings public. That's kind of a PSO question.
okay, well, we can.
I'm not 100% sure of that, but that is a great question, and I will try to find that out. Or if our PSO. Oh, okay. So Daniel's here. Daniel, are the slide decks also made public, or is it just the recordings? If you can let us know. Oh, okay. So it is possible to share the PowerPoints if the speakers are comfortable with that, and if we would like to. So that's good. That's good. Let's see. In questions, I don't have questions.
It says, from the
Oh, from the
Woba
Human
chat.
chat. Okay, I haven't seen that. Let's see. What are some considerations in space medicine that you think are applicable to austere medical environments on Earth? That's a great question.
Well, I mean, the utilization of telemedicine is for sure. I don't know how many people participated in the earlier analog one that Dr. Nikogosian was participating in, but they talked about Mount Everest and people living and working at Houghton Crater. And about 20 years ago, a little more than 20 years ago, we did a lot of research at base camp with the Explorers Club. When I was at Yale, we had a commercial space center that Dr. Nikogosian created there for us. And we evaluated different technologies. And so when you think about remote healthcare and electronic health records and sensor arrays, these things have been developed in part by NASA for NASA, but not all by NASA. Obviously, the DoD has done a lot of work in sensor arrays and so forth for military applications, Space Force, I'm sure. But all those things find their way into austere environments. And so when you think about things like, and I remember we were in Moscow once and we went to, I don't know, maybe John was with us when we went to the store, went over there with one of the flight surgeons, and there's a vending machine that sells contact lenses, right? So who would ever thought that you could buy your contact lenses in a vending machine? But we started talking about, can you package medication or the active ingredient in the medication in a machine and have it in somewhere in North Dakota where there's no pharmacist for 150 miles and actually have your medication made right on the spot, right? This is with robotics and sensors and new devices that are coming out almost daily now. And so I think that much of what we've seen in space medicine will find its way into terrestrial medicine, and terrestrial medicine obviously influences space medicine as well. Does that answer the question?
The space program, NASA looks at, back to pharmaceuticals, not only what's a good pharmaceutical to take, but how long will it last, given an austere environment. Tools themselves, the medical tools, have to be put together in such a manner as they're not requiring a lot of maintenance. So something that will be durable in a more austere environment. DoD is getting a lot of experience with that, and they've been working on that and for many years with their deployed forces. What's the basic essentials you need to take? You're not going to take the MRI. Well, maybe not. You might be able to have an MRI. It might be small enough eventually. On board space station, they're using OCT examinations now for the eyeball that never would have existed 10 years ago. Maybe it is 10 years now, Chuck.
Well, I was going to say, John, one of the things, there was a time when there was some NASA commercial space centers, and the one I was involved in was at Yale and then at VCU down in Richmond. But there was a guy at Florida Atlantic. He developed an ultrasound probe. Mm-hmm. This is not an ultrasound probe and a cell phone. And he put them two together, and that was an ultrasound device. Mm-hmm. Sonosite is the smallest one now. It's about the size of a phone, a desk phone, which are also disappearing from the office. But you have the cell phone, which you can do PowerPoint, Excel, all kind of things with this. And you have a probe. Now it can only look at soft tissue injury. You can't look down into the liver or deep in the lung, but they can look at the surface, right? So, and they're doing this on the eye. So one of our colleagues in Houston, he was one of the top ultrasonographers in all of Soviet Armenia. He's in Houston now. He's been there for over 25 years, almost 30 years now, I think. And a lot of that technology is developed because it needs to be small. It needs to have low maintenance. It has to be easy to use because the astronauts are trained on it all. But imagine trying to talk somebody through a problem. Like we've all had problems with a computer, and you call, the bank, or you call AOL or Verizon or Comcast or whoever and this person answers the phone, doesn't speak English very well, and the distance is it's very difficult, right? So imagine trying to do that on the way to Mars, which means everything that goes on a Mars mission has to be autonomous. Yep. You have to have the ability to practice medicine. There's 8 or 9 reports written on surgery in extreme environments. I've written 5 of them, and I'm not a surgeon. And I said to my previous chief medical officer, Rich Williams, who many of you know, who is a surgeon, an actual surgeon, not just a flight surgeon. And he said, we're never going to do surgery in space. And I'm like, okay, maybe that's true, but that implies we're never going to go to Mars. Because at some point, human society will actually be living on Mars. Now, it may be 100 years from now. It may be when a monster of all rockets goes up and takes 100 people up there. I don't know, but at some point, society will move to another planet, and there you'll have things like burial grounds, cemeteries, fire departments, police departments, trash removal, schools. Somebody will be born up there. All these things are in the future, and we know about this much if that will work, because we're not there yet.
Mhm.
But that's where we're going. And so, like I said earlier, Kristen, that young little boy, little girl that's going to be studying this stuff in the college and the university setting in the next 20 to 30 years, they're the ones that are going to make those discoveries. And so it's, I mean, I almost sound like the administrator now. It's so exciting that where we're going, and the platforms that got us here, John and I have been involved in for the last 25 or 30 years, and the same with Dr. Nicogosian and others. We've actually laid the foundation for those to follow. And the foundation, in my mind, is pretty strong.
Right, absolutely.
Kristen, are we out of time?
We have a couple more minutes. If you wanted to add something, go right ahead.
Well, so Chris Myers, you're right. Your 6-year-old, exactly that person. I saw that pop up. No, I think Chuck as always is just spot on about this. And even though he and I may sound like cheerleaders at some point in time, I think we're all here because we are enthusiasts about all of this and trying to figure out the best way to do it. The nice part about the way I see it in terms of, and not because I'm in it, but because I see from the commercial sector, there's an opportunity to gain a whole lot of more information about a whole lot more people in terms of how they respond to to space flight, that will make then that what Chuck is talking about, that ability to then land on another terrestrial place and live there longer, more informed, better informed about how does the average, if there is one of those, human respond to space flight and the rigors of being in space. So I think there's a lot of exciting stuff to come. I think there's a lot of interest from a research side, whether it's research on humans or it's biomedical tissue or crystals or whatever. There's going to be a lot that's going to be taking place in the future. So it's a fun time. I'm glad I'm still in it.
Well, the only other thing I wanted to do real quick, and maybe, I don't know, I don't think it's inappropriate, but not that I'm trying to sell, but this book is something that Dr. Nicogosian and I, John Allen, and others have written. You can see it's pretty thick. Kristen and I and Arnold are actually working on the 5th edition. And by looking at my email back and forth while I'm doing this, the lawyers are finally agreeing. So we'll see the 5th edition of this. And the importance of this is this is a high-speed, low-pass about space medicine. It doesn't go into the fine details physiologically, but it gives the reader a really awesome view of firsthand experience. You've got people in this 4th edition. You've got the 3 chief medical officers. Carol Huntoon, in charge of life sciences, was a center director and undersecretary for energy for George Bush, and me, who's just, me. And so I think the importance of that is that the knowledge gained in these successive programs and the knowledge gained on Artemis, it's not like Artemis is taking a step back. It's smaller. It's a destination program, whereas Shuttle was more of a delivery research vessel. It's the Mars mission in the next 20 to 30 years that really will begin to change, I think, the technology and the ability of the human race to move to the next level, whatever that level is.
Absolutely.
I see Eric Pitchler has a question. Up until now, reporting policies have mostly relied on voluntary disclosure regarding psychological effects, physiological effects of, and psychological as well, of prolonged exposure to microgravity. You see a policy shift that would require the release of medical information to expand the knowledge base in preparation for a Mars mission. My personal opinion, I do not see a particular shift in that policy. I think privacy is privacy, and we have to respect that in an individual's willingness to participate in the work that's done. I do think that as we collect more information, as if that transport to Mars becomes real, there will be more and more willingness. And actually, we've had much more, I think, more willingness from our astronaut colleagues, government astronauts, to release the information or make information available to researchers. Still may be there on an anonymous basis, but at least have the data available. And there's a lot of work that's been done through NASA to make that happen. But I think, again, from the commercial sector, as we get more and more information there, once again, the data may go into a database where you can't sort out who that was, but we'll get a lot more information. And I think people will be more inclined to make their data available, probably with that protection of privacy involved in it.
Thank you.
Chuck, I don't know if you have a view on that.
Yeah.
Or are we done? I don't know.
Well, no, I mean, we could, as you know, we could talk for hours because this is a fascinating
Right.
subject.
It is a fascinating subject. I'm wishing we had a 2-hour long panel. It would be great to keep talking about these things, and we are actually out of time. So I think unfortunately we have to end, but thank you both so much for wonderful presentations and for just really interesting discussion. And thank you to everyone who has been part of the audience. We appreciate you guys being here. We appreciate the comments and the questions. And thank you for supporting this panel. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks,
See you
everybody.
there. Thanks. See you all later. Have fun in Paris, John,
Au
Yeah.
revoir.
or Italy, or wherever. Bonjour.